So, will Obama's private sector flub haunt him through November? Joining us now for a Kudlow face-off, we have former DNC chairman and CNBC contributor Howard Dean and Sean Spicer, communications director at the Republican National Committee. Welcome back, gentlemen. Howard Dean, flip-flops are bad for your presidential health. We showed the earlier John Kerry and John McCain. I don't see how President Obama is going to get through this.
President Obama is going to get through this just fine. Most people know that the private economy has done better than the public economy, and then they've got Mitt Romney saying he wants to fire firefighters and ambulance drivers and stuff like that. Look, the bottom line is this. It comes down to what you believe. People believe by about a 10-point margin that Barack Obama is working better than Mitt Romney could at fixing the economy, and they believe by about a 2-to-1 margin that Barack Obama cares about ordinary people than Mitt Romney doesn't. It's going to be very hard to overcome that
Sean
for Mitt
Spicer,
Romney.
With all my respect for Howard Dean, I don't know anybody that believes that Obama is more confident or has better approval on the economy. But, Sean, isn't the Republican National Committee going to show the flip-flop? First, President Obama says the private sector is doing great, and then he comes around a few hours later and says, oops, no, we know the economy is not great. Now, those flip-flops are dangerous to your presidential health, aren't they?
Oh, they're horrible. I mean, for weeks they've been going out trying to have their surrogates walk back some of the things they said, and in this case it was the president himself. But I think, Larry, the difference in what we saw Friday wasn't a gaffe. It was a true admission as to the economic philosophy of this administration. They put the public sector first and the private sector second. And I think the problem is this, and Governor Dean knows this firsthand from his experience in Vermont, is that you have to have a thriving public sector, excuse me, a thriving private sector to pay for the public sector. We're all in support of firefighters and police officers and teachers, but those salaries can only derive from people who go out there and make a living in the private sector and pay their taxes and fund them. So if you don't support a thriving private sector, you can never have a public sector that is good for your community.
Governor Dean, isn't that really the second part of the flop that President Obama made? I mean, you know, of course, the Scott Walker victory in Wisconsin, but also he wants to cut back on pensions and benefits. So do the people in San Diego. So do the people in San Jose. This is a national movement. Obama wants to feed more money into the very state and localities that people want to cut back, Governor Dean.
Well, first of all, the job losses in this country are mostly private sector, public sector losses. I would agree with Sean. I think that you do need a strong private sector. That's exactly what the president is beginning to deliver. We've had significant job growth over the last year. The problem is it's been partly offset by huge cuts in the public sector, but mostly by Republican governors. And also, I fundamentally disagree with your notion that there was a big victory for Scott Walker. Scott Walker lost control of the Senate, which wasn't reported by the mainstream media, surprisingly, the other night in Wisconsin. So I don't think Scott Walker had a particularly good night. Now he can't get his stuff through the Senate. And I do think that Sean is right. We want a strong private sector in order to enable a good public sector, particularly in education. And I think we've had a stronger private sector, certainly under Barack Obama, than we did under George Bush.
Sean Spicer.
First, Larry, just to correct not to correct the governor, but let's face it, in Wisconsin, yes, they took control of the state Senate that's out of session for the entire year, and through redistricting, we're going to have it back by the time it goes back into session. So that's not a big consolation prize. Second, I would argue that there are millions of Americans, 23 of them, 23 million to be precise, that are out of work right now and struggling. They're struggling to fill up their gas tanks, to pay their health care, to pay their kids' college tuition. They're struggling to find a job. Unemployment is 8.2%. I don't think anyone in this country really is saying, hey, the private sector's doing well, because if they have a job, they're concerned about whether they're going to keep it, whether they're going to get a raise. So I'll be honest with you. I think anybody that's out there saying the private sector's doing well are probably, they're welcome to come vote for us and have a governor like Mitt Romney turn this country around and actually push for a thriving private sector.
Governor Dean, again, on this point that Sean is making so eloquently, you know, doesn't President Obama really reveal himself in this whole flip-flop that occurred Friday as a big government man, not as a private guy? He reveals himself, you know, he wants to throw more money at the public sector unions, which were voted down in the Scott Walker election and also in the California elections. In other words, reports. Doesn't President Obama really play his hand, and it's exactly what folks don't want?
First of all, when Mitt Romney was governor of Massachusetts, Massachusetts was 47th out of 50 in terms of job creation in the private sector. So this is a ridiculous argument. The truth is that the president wants a strong private sector, and the president has a much stronger private sector than the one he inherited when he took the oath of office in 2009. The big job loss problem, as I've said before, and the people who are really at risk of losing their jobs are firemen and policemen and teachers. And if you want a strong private sector, you've got to have a good education system. And I think the president understands that, and I don't think Governor Romney does understand that.
Sean, I thought it was the private taxpayers, the men and women in business and who own small business, that were responsible for financing the public sector. And sometimes those public unions forget that. Aren't they really at the beck and call of the taxpayers working in the private sector business?
Well, I think that there are the people who serve our country, whether at the local, state, or federal level. Most of them are dedicated servants and do a great job. Firemen, police officers, teachers, they're great out there in terms of what they do for this country. So, but at the same time, if we don't have hardworking taxpayers out there, we don't create a system that doesn't stifle job creators with regulation, with Obamacare, with things like that stop that growth, then we can't have the public sector that we want to have to support our community. So I think the problem here is that with Obamacare, with the regulations, with the added debt and deficit, and the mistaken priorities of this administration, then you're never going to be able to have the public sector that you want in your community because there's not enough funding for it because the taxpayers can't afford it.
That's the deal. That's what I think the deal is. I don't know if President Obama gets that or not. I believe former Governor Howard Dean, in his heart, really does get that. Anyway, gentlemen, I'm going to leave it there. Governor Howard Dean and Sean Spicer, thank you ever so much.
Thank you.